The bayous of Louisiana were thick with stories, not the kind you found in books, but the kind whispered between families, passed down like inheritance, like warning signs. Stories about men who went missing after standing up to the wrong people. Stories about towns where black folks weren't allowed after dark. Stories that lived in the bones of people who knew better than to forget. For Josephine Jo Dupree, the bayou wasn't just home. It was a battleground. And today, she was walking into a war she never asked for. Jo had grown up in Gator's Hollow, a small town in the heart of the Atchafalaya Basin, where the air was thick with humidity and history. A place where white men still called black men boy, like the world hadn't changed. A place where her grandfather had fought to keep his land, where her father had nearly lost it, and now they were coming for hers. It started with a letter, official-looking, stamped with a government seal. The words were cold, sharp, emotionless. Eminent domain. They were seizing her family's land to build a pipeline that would cut through the marsh, through the water her people had fished for generations, through the soil that held the bones of her ancestors. And they were offering pennies in return. Jo read the letter 3 times. Then she burned it. Because if they thought she was just going to let them take what was hers, they didn't know who the hell they were dealing with. She took the fight to the courthouse, filed an injunction, rallied the town, marched right up to Mayor Curtis LeBlanc, a man whose family had owned half of Gator's Hollow for a century, and told him, "You're not taking my land." LeBlanc had just smiled. "This is progress, Ms. Dupree," he said. Jo clenched her jaw. Progress for who? The mayor's smile never faded. For the people who matter. And just like that, she knew. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about land. This was about erasing the last black-owned property in Gator's Hollow, and Jo was the only thing standing in their way. The threats came fast. First, anonymous letters slipped under her door. Then, a dead gator carcass left on her porch, its throat slit, blood pooling in the dirt. Then, the fire. It happened in the middle of the night. Her burned to the ground. The air filled with the scent of ash and gasoline. And when she called the sheriff, he never came. Because in Gator's Hollow, justice had always been selective. Jo wasn't stupid. She knew this was how it started. Intimidation, threats, and then disappearances. Like her uncle back in '73, who had spoken out against the town and been found face down in the swamp. Like her neighbor, who had fought against the same men and never made it home. But Jo had spent her whole life fighting for what was hers. And if they wanted her gone, they were gonna have to drag her out kicking. She took the fight to the state courts, hired a lawyer from New Orleans, a woman named Camille St. John, who walked into the courtroom like she already owned it. And when they presented their case, they exposed everything. The pipeline deal wasn't just corrupt, it was illegal. Built on fake documents, backdoor deals, and stolen land. And when Camille stood before the judge and said, "Your Honor, this is theft disguised as progress," the courtroom fell silent. Because they all knew it was true. The mayor fought back, tried to bury the case, tried to buy off the judge, tried to frame Joe for arson, claiming she burned her own barn down for attention. But the town had had enough. Because Joe wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every family that had been pushed out before her. And this time, they weren't staying quiet. The protests shut the town down. Black, white, young, old. People stood together in the streets, blocking roads, chaining themselves to the courthouse steps. The mayor called in the police, told them to handle it, and the next night, they came in riot gear, tear gas, batons, a reminder of how Gator's Hollow had always treated its black residents. And Joy? She stood in the middle of it all, shoulders squared, fists clenched, staring down the line of cops like she dared them to move her. And when they swung, the cameras were rolling. The footage went viral. A black woman, blood on her face, standing in front of a line of white men with shields and clubs. A black woman refusing to back down. The headlines read, "The battle for Gator's Hollow. They want to erase us. Fighting for more than land." And just like that, the whole country was watching. The pressure mounted. The governor stepped in. The mayor resigned. And the court? They ruled in Joe's favor. The land was hers. The pipeline project? For the first time in history, a black woman had stood against the entire system of Gator's Hollow and won. But Joe knew the fight wasn't over, because if they couldn't take her land through courts, they would try to take it through bullets. So she prepared. She built her own security.
Armed her neighbors. Made sure that if they came for her, she would be ready, because the bayou belonged to her people.
And as long as she was alive, no one was taking it from them again. The bayou never forgot. It carried stories like whispers in the wind, hiding them in the thick marsh air, in the sway of the cypress trees, in the ripple of the water where ghosts lingered. And for Josephine Jo Dupree, the bayou had just written her name into its history. She had fought. She had won. The land that had belonged to her family for generations was still hers. The pipeline deal, dead. The mayor who tried to push her out, gone. For the first time in her life, Joe had beaten them. But the thing about victory, it always comes with a price. And in Gator's Hollow, nothing stayed quiet for long. It started 6 months later. A sound in the night. Not the usual symphony of the bayou.
Not the cicadas, or the frogs, or the soft splash of an alligator slipping into the water.
This was different. A low hum deep in the trees. A faint glow, barely visible through the mist. Joe stepped onto her porch, shotgun in hand, scanning the darkness. Then, a scream. Sharp, distant, coming from the woods. Joe ran through the trees, past the old hunting trails her grandfather had carved when he was a boy, the mud thick beneath her boots, and then she saw it. A fire. A burning cross planted deep in the soil on her land.
And in the flickering light,
a man hung from a tree. His name was Louis Landry, a black fisherman. A father, a man who had stood beside Joe during the protests. Now, he was dead, strung up like a warning, like a message, like a promise. Gator's Hollow wasn't done with her yet. Joe's stomach twisted. Her hands shook with rage. This wasn't just hate. This was revenge. And she knew exactly who was behind it. The Palmetto Riders, an old name in Gator's Hollow, a group that had once ridden through the swamps with white hoods, burning homes, killing men, keeping the town under their control. People thought they were gone, but Joe knew the truth. They hadn't disappeared.
They had just put on new faces.
New uniforms, and now they were coming back. The sheriff ruled it a suicide. Joe laughed in his face. "You really think we're that stupid?" The sheriff just shrugged. No witnesses, no evidence, no case. Joe leaned in, voice low. "You don't need evidence when you already know who did it." The sheriff's smile faded, and Joe saw it in his eyes. A flicker of fear, because even he knew this wasn't just about one murder. This was about taking the town back. And Joe? She was in the way. So she took the fight to them, rallied the people, called in activists, lawyers, reporters, made sure the world saw what was happening in Gator's Hollow. Because she had learned one thing from her last fight: they could kill a man in the dark, but they couldn't kill a movement under the spotlight. The Palmetto Riders fought back. They called her a liar. They spread rumors.
Tried to paint Louis Landry as a criminal.
Tried to paint Joe as the real problem. But Joe had proof. She had names. She had the truth. And the truth doesn't die. Then the next body appeared. Camille Saint-Jean, Joe's lawyer, the one who had helped her win the case against the pipeline. Her car was found burned to nothing, deep in the swamp. And Joe knew this wasn't just about her anymore. They were cleaning house, killing anyone who had stood beside her. And she was next. The FBI arrived a week later. Not because they wanted to, not because they cared, but because the whole country was watching now. 2 murders, 1 town, a history of racist violence, and 1 black woman standing in the center of it all. The agent sat across from Joe in her living room. One of them, a white man with tired eyes, sighed. "We need you to leave town, Miss Dupree." Joe folded her arms. "This is my home."
The agent rubbed his forehead.
"You stay, and you won't make it another month." Joe's voice was like steel. "Then I guess y'all better start investigating a murder in advance." The Palmetto Riders knew she wouldn't leave. They counted on it. So they planned something bigger, something final. They were going to burn her house down, with her inside, make it look like an accident, like a warning. But what they didn't count on was that Joe was waiting for them. The night they came, the sky was black as ink. A truck rumbled up her dirt road, headlights off. Men in masks, carrying gasoline cans and rifles. They stepped onto her porch, and the first gunshot rang out. Not from them, from Joe. She fired from the tree line, hidden in the darkness. More shots, more voices yelling, because Joe wasn't alone. Her people were with her, armed, ready, and for the first time in history,
The Palmetto Riders were the ones running.
by morning, 6 men were in jail, charged with arson, conspiracy, murder, and one name stood out among them: Curtis LeBlanc, the former mayor, the man who had tried to steal her land, the man who had sworn revenge. Now, he sat in a jail cell, his hands shaking, his legacy burned to ash. Jo stood on her porch, shotgun still in hand, staring at the rising sun. She had won again, but she knew they would never stop trying to take what was hers. Because history didn't just disappear. It waited, it watched, and the only way to kill it was to never stop fighting. Chapter 1. The line that split the town. In the heart of a small southern town, an invisible line separated two communities. On one side, modernity and progress thrived. Gleaming storefronts, bustling cafes, and newly paved streets reflected the town's prosperity. On the other side, buildings showed their age, with peeling paint and broken sidewalks, a stark reminder of decades of neglect. The divide wasn't just physical, it was social, emotional, and deeply embedded in the town's history, woven into the daily lives of its residents. For generations, the people had lived by unspoken rules that dictated where they shopped, where they worshipped, and whom they called friends. The older generation accepted the status quo without question, having been raised in a time when crossing the invisible boundary had consequences. But younger residents, like high school students who played together on the same sports teams, began questioning why they were expected to remain apart after the final whistle blew. Despite the growing curiosity among the town's youth, many elders refused to acknowledge the need for change. Tradition, they argued, was not something to be erased by fleeting desires for unity. But for young journalist Daniel Carter, this divide was more than just a relic of the past. It was a story that needed to be told. Daniel had grown up in the town, watching from the sidelines as the world around him evolved, while his community remained stubbornly unchanged. Now, a fresh-faced reporter at the local paper, he saw an opportunity to shed light on the divide, to expose the silent walls that dictated who belonged where. He knew it wouldn't be easy. People feared change. They feared exposing wounds that had never fully healed. His first step was simple: listening. He spent days walking the streets, speaking with shop owners, pastors, teachers, and teenagers. He heard the pain in the voices of those who had been refused service, the frustration of business owners who had lost customers for daring to challenge the system, and the sorrow of elders who remembered a time before the divide became so deeply entrenched. The town was a living contradiction, filled with both resistance and an unspoken yearning for something different. One evening, as Daniel sat in the dim glow of his office, flipping through pages of old newspapers, he stumbled upon a story from the 1950 S's. The town had not always been so divided. There had been a time when children of all backgrounds played together, when businesses thrived on shared prosperity. But a single event had sparked the slow but steady separation. What had happened? Who had decided this divide must remain? As Daniel dug deeper, he realized that the line splitting the town was not as permanent as many believed. It had been created by people, and perhaps with courage and effort, it could be erased by them as well. Chapter 2. The Unspoken Rules. Despite no official segregation laws, the town operated under an unspoken set of rules that dictated the daily lives of its residents. Black and white citizens lived parallel existences. their interactions limited to necessity rather than choice. Separate grocery stores, barber shops, and diners catered exclusively to one side or the other. Even the town's two churches, standing barely a few blocks apart, never saw mixed congregations. Daniel began his investigation by speaking with long-time residents, hoping to understand how such a system had endured despite changing times. Older members of the community recalled a period of quiet tolerance, a time when small acts of defiance, like children playing together in secret or shared conversations in the town square, were brushed aside rather than punished. But over the years, unspoken rules solidified into an invisible wall, an unbreakable boundary that kept the two groups apart. As he dug deeper, Daniel uncovered stories of businesses that had suffered for attempting to bridge the divide. A small cafe owner who had once allowed black and white patrons to dine together had mysteriously lost his lease. A schoolteacher who encouraged unity among students had been pressured to resign. These weren't isolated events, they were warnings, silent reminders of the town's rigid structure. Some residents saw no issue with these divisions, arguing that it was simply the way things had always been. Others, however, whispered of the quiet fear that kept them from speaking out. Daniel soon realized that the divide was not just accepted, it was actively maintained by those who stood to benefit from it. Those who challenged it faced consequences, some subtle, others devastating. As Daniel pieced together the town's past, he came to a chilling conclusion. The segregation that defined the town wasn't a relic of history, but a carefully upheld reality, enforced by the powerful and feared by the weak. And breaking these rules would come at a cost. Chapter 3. A Spark of Change. A group of high school students, black and white, refused to accept the division that had long plagued their town. Led by Maria Thompson, an outspoken activist determined to challenge the status quo, and James Parker, a quiet but resolute leader, they set out to create a moment of unity that had never been seen before. Their vision was simple yet revolutionary, a community gathering where both sides could come together, talk, share stories, and celebrate their common humanity. The idea spread quickly among the younger generation, but not everyone was on board. Some students feared the consequences of defying the unwritten rules of their town. Parents warned their children to stay away. Shopkeepers cast suspicious glances, and whispers of disapproval echoed through the hallways of their school. Still, Maria and James remained undeterred. The resistance grew stronger as their plans solidified. Flyers for the event were torn down as soon as they were posted. Threats, anonymous notes slipped into lockers, and murmured warnings at the grocery store began to surface. Some teachers cautioned them to reconsider, suggesting they were stirring up trouble that the town wasn't ready to face. But Maria and James knew that real change was never easy. Despite the fear, support also began to emerge. A local pastor offered the students a safe space for their meetings, while a retired teacher shared stories of the town's forgotten history, stories of a time when the community had not always been so divided. These small acts of encouragement fueled the students' determination. As the day of the event approached, tension filled the air. The town was watching, waiting to see what would happen. Maria and James understood the risks, but they also knew that if no one took the first step, nothing would ever change. Their movement was growing, and the walls of segregation, both physical and emotional, were beginning to tremble. Chapter 4. the resistance. The town's older generation saw the event as a threat to their way of life. They had spent decades enforcing the social and economic divide, benefiting from the unspoken rules that kept power firmly in their hands. To them, integration was not just about sharing spaces, it was about losing control. If the barriers fell, so would their influence. As word of the event spread, resistance turned to retaliation. Some business owners refused service to anyone involved in the gathering, placing signs in their windows that subtly warned against disturbing the peace. Church leaders spoke in sermons about the dangers of disrupting tradition, warning their congregations of the consequences of betraying their heritage. Fear became a weapon, wielded with precision to keep people in their place. Then came the threats. Anonymous notes were left on doorsteps, scrawled in messy handwriting, warning participants to stay away or pay the price. Maria Thompson found one pinned to her family's front door. James Parker's tires were slashed. Their families grew anxious, urging them to back down, but the students refused to be silenced. Daniel followed the conflict closely, documenting every threat, every act of sabotage, and every attempt to undermine the movement. Through his investigation, he uncovered a deeper truth. The divide wasn't just about race, it was about power. Those who had built their lives upon the foundation of separation weren't willing to let it crumble. They saw the fight for unity as an attack, and they would do everything they could to stop it. Despite the growing danger, Mariah, James, and their supporters pressed forward. They knew that standing up meant risking everything, but they also understood that if they backed down now, the town would never change. The walls of segregation had begun to tremble, but the battle was far from over. Chapter 5. The Night of the Protest. On the eve of the community event, tensions reached a boiling point. Protesters lined the streets, their voices clashing in a chaotic symphony. Some held banners advocating unity, their faces filled with determination, while others shouted, their words dripping with resistance and fear of change. The town had never seen anything like this, a confrontation of ideals that had been buried beneath silence for generations. Police officers stood on edge, their presence both reassuring and intimidating. Business owners shut their doors early, fearing that the night would bring destruction rather than reconciliation. As darkness fell, the atmosphere thickened with uncertainty. Every step forward by the students felt like a challenge to history itself. Maria and James stood at the front of the march, their hands gripping a banner that read, "One town, one future." They knew the risks, but fear had no place in their hearts tonight. Daniel moved among the protesters, notebook in hand, documenting every moment. He captured the hopeful faces of the young, the hardened expressions of the old, and the anger of those who refused to let go of the past. The protest remained peaceful at first, with speeches made in front of the town hall, but tension had a way of igniting at the slightest spark. A glass bottle shattered against the pavement, a scuffle broke out near a storefront, angry voices turned to shouts, and suddenly the threat of violence was real. The students held their ground, refusing to be the ones to incite destruction. Their message was clear. They would not be silent. Daniel stood among them, knowing that this night would define the town's future. Whether for better or worse, depended on what happened next. Chapter 6. Breaking the Silence. As speeches were made and voices were raised, something remarkable happened. The crowd, initially divided by decades of segregation, began to shift. Elders from both sides hesitated at first, but then, one by one, they stepped forward. They spoke of a time before the divide had hardened into an unspoken rule, before fear and habit had built an invisible wall between them. An elderly man, his hands trembling, cleared his throat and recounted how he had once played in the fields with friends of all races as a child, before society told him it was wrong. A woman, her voice thick with emotion, admitted that she had turned away from friendships because she had been told to do so, and she had regretted it ever since. Another elder, who had once owned a store that refused service to black customers, lowered his head and said, "I was wrong. I see that now." Their words hung heavy in the air, stirring memories and emotions that had long been buried. As more people spoke, the silence that had ruled the town for so long was finally broken, not through hushed whispers or secret conversations, but openly, for all to hear. The students stood at the front, watching with wide eyes as the older generation, those who had upheld the rules for so long, began to tear them down. Maria and James exchanged glances, realizing that this was bigger than they had imagined. This wasn't just a protest, this was the beginning of something new. A long overdue conversation had started, and it would not be easily silenced again. Chapter 7. The Backlash. Change, however, came at a cost. The morning after the protest, the town awoke to find a new battle unfolding. Businesses that had openly supported the movement were vandalized, their windows shattered, hateful messages scrawled across their doors. Maria's family found a threatening note nailed to their porch, warning them to stop or suffer the consequences. James, once a respected student athlete, was cornered in the school hallway and called a traitor. Fear rippled through the town, threatening to undo the progress that had been made. For every person who celebrated the movement, there was another who saw it as a betrayal of tradition. Arguments erupted in grocery stores, in churches, even within families. Daniel's articles, which had initially served as a voice for the movement, now became the center of controversy. Some readers lauded him for exposing the town's dark secrets, while others accused him of stirring division. His editor received letters demanding he be fired, his reporting condemned as an attempt to tear the town apart. As tensions rose, outside voices began to take notice. Civil rights organizations offered support, while news outlets from nearby cities ran stories on the unfolding events. National attention turned a local movement into something bigger, adding fuel to both sides. Maria and James received offers to speak at larger gatherings, but with every new headline, the resistance in town grew stronger. People who had once been silent now found themselves forced to choose a side. The backlash was not just about race, it was about power. Those who had built their lives upon the foundation of separation feared what might happen if that foundation crumbled. But the students refused to back down. They had started something too big to stop. And despite the danger, they knew that if they gave in now, the progress they had fought for would be lost. As the town teetered on the edge of further unrest, Daniel realized something profound. The battle was no longer about one night of protest. It was about the future of the town itself. And the story was far from over. Chapter 8. Confronting the Past. Determined to bridge the gap, Daniel and the students organized a town meeting, inviting voices from both sides to speak openly. They secured the town hall, unsure of how many people would come, but hopeful that even a few honest conversations could make a difference. As the evening arrived, the hall filled beyond capacity. Some came out of curiosity, others out of skepticism, but many came because they were ready to listen. Daniel stood at the front, alongside Maria and James, scanning the crowd. He saw familiar faces. Elders who had lived through the height of segregation, younger residents who had never known anything else, and those who had suffered silently. The tension in the room was palpable, but it was a silence that begged to be broken. The first to speak was an elderly man, his voice shaky yet firm. "I remember a time when we weren't so divided," he said. "I had friends I wasn't allowed to keep, places I was told I couldn't go, and I regret it. I regret that I let fear dictate my choices." His words set off a ripple effect. A woman stood next, tears in her eyes, sharing how she had turned away from a friend in high school simply because that was what was expected of her. A middle-aged man admitted that he had actively avoided conversations about race because it was easier to stay quiet than to challenge the norm. Then came the stories of pain, of denied opportunities, of families torn apart by prejudice, of friendships lost before they could truly begin. But as more voices filled the room, something changed. There was no shouting, no heated arguments, just listening, and for the first time, true understanding. By the end of the night, the town had taken its first real step toward healing. No solutions were finalized and no promises were made, but something far more powerful had happened. The people of the town had finally spoken, honestly, openly, and in that there was hope. Chapter 9. A New Beginning. Months later, the town bore the marks of transformation. While remnants of old divisions still lingered, a newfound spirit of unity had begun to take hold. The once avoided streets between neighborhoods were now filled with the laughter of children playing together, their innocence unfazed by the history that had once kept their families apart. Businesses that had previously served only one demographic now welcomed all customers. The once segregated counters now bustling with diverse patrons, sharing meals and conversations. Shop owners who had once hesitated to embrace change found that unity brought not just a moral shift but also prosperity. New customers, new friendships, and a renewed sense of purpose. Schools that had long enforced quiet segregation through unspoken policies took deliberate steps toward integration. Classrooms became spaces for open discussions, and teachers introduced history lessons that spoke the full truth, not just the comfortable version passed down through generations. Young students formed friendships without the burden of inherited prejudice, offering a glimpse of what the town's future could become. Daniel's final article captured these changes in vivid detail, but more than that, it reflected the town's ongoing journey. The struggles of the past were not erased, nor were they forgotten. Instead, they served as lessons, reminders of what could happen when fear dictated the course of a community's future. His words resonated beyond the town, drawing attention to a place that had once been a symbol of division, but now stood as proof that progress, though slow and painful, was possible. The road ahead was not without challenges. There were still those who resisted, clinging to a past that offered them certainty. But the tide had turned, and the movement for change had taken root in the hearts of the younger generation. They refused to inherit the prejudices of the past, determined instead to build something better. Daniel stood on Main Street, watching as people who once avoided each other now exchanged greetings, as laughter and conversation replaced the cold silence that had once defined the town. He realized that his final article wasn't just about a divided town. It was about a town learning, growing, and choosing every day to come together. Chapter 10: The Legacy of Change. Years later, Daniel returned to the town that had once been divided. Time had softened some of its edges, but the past remained etched into the streets and buildings, a silent reminder of the struggle that had taken place. The old segregation lines, once unspoken rules, had faded, but not disappeared entirely. Yet, amidst the echoes of history, there was undeniable progress. The students who had once led the fight for change had now become the town's leaders, teachers, business owners, and policymakers. Maria Thompson, now a lawyer, worked to ensure that no unfair laws or practices would ever return. James Parker had dedicated his life to education, heading programs that encouraged inclusivity in schools. Many of the younger generation had chosen to stay in the town rather than flee from its past, determined to mold it into something better. Daniel walked along Main Street, noticing the small yet significant changes. The diner that had once refused service to mixed crowds was now a bustling hub of activity, where families of all backgrounds gathered. The two separate churches had started holding joint services, their congregations slowly merging over the years. The town school, once divided by tradition, now displayed murals painted by students of different races, telling stories of both pain and progress. As he passed by the town square, Daniel spotted a new addition, an engraved plaque that read, "We remember the past, so we may never repeat it." Beneath it were the names of those who had played pivotal roles in the movement for change. He smiled, recognizing many names, some of whom had sacrificed greatly for the unity the town was beginning to embrace. The struggle wasn't over. There were still those who resisted, still moments when old prejudices resurfaced, but the difference was clear. There were now more people willing to stand against them. The town had changed, not because time had forced it to, but because its people had chosen to fight for something better. For Daniel, that was everything. It was proof that progress, no matter how slow or painful, was always worth the battle.